Well, hello again, and welcome again to another reading. Uh, we're going through this book by John Knox, and it's actually Calvin's Institutions of Christian Religions. You know, a lot of times when we throw the word Christian religion, you're throwing it into a basket with a lot of different religions. They're not all the same. They don't all teach the same. And a lot of them have different doctrines. So when you say, well, I'm a Christian, what do you actually mean that you're a Christian? That you're a follower of Christ? That's very true. But also, what are your fundamental doctrines? And there are a lot of different doctrines out there. Now, last time we got together, I was having the computer do some reading, but from this point on, as we go through these chapters, and right now we're going to be in the first book. And if we look at the first book, there's actually 18 chapters in the first book. And it really deals with the knowledge of God as a creator. So when we say we're going to go through the first book, just remember there's 4 books in these volumes. So let me just jump ahead here real quick. And this is the institutions of the Christian religions. And this is the first book of the knowledge of God, the Creator. Okay? Now let's just look at the argument here. And I'm going to change the views here. And in the very first book, we have an argument. And the first book treats of the knowledge of God, the Creator. But as it is the creation of man that is the divine perfection, are best displayed, so man also is made the subject of the discord. So we can't look at the Creator without looking at the creation. Thus the whole book divides itself into 2 principal heads. The former relates to the knowledge of God, and the latter to the knowledge of man. In the first chapter, they are considered jointly, and in each of the following chapters separately. Occasionally, however, intermingled with other matters which refer to one of others of the head, literally the discussions concerning Scripture and images falling under the former head, and the other 3 concerning the creation of the world. The holy angels, the devil, fallen under the latter, and the last point discussed was the method of the divine government related to both. Okay, with regards to the former head, is the knowledge of God it is shown in the first place what the kind of knowledge is God's required. Chapter 2, and in the second place, chapters 3 through 9, where this knowledge must be sound, namely, not in man's, because altogether, although naturally implanted in the human mind, it is shifting partly by ignorance, partly by evil intents. In chapter 3 and 4, not in the frame of the world, because although it shines most clearly through, clearly there, we are so stupid that they manifestly, however, perspectives pass our way without any beneficial results. Chapter 5 in the scriptures, and chapter 6, which is treated in chapters 7 through 9, in the third place, it is shown what the chapter of God is, chapter 10, in the fourth place. How impious it is to give visible forms of God, here images and worship of them, and the origin are considered. Chapter 11, in the fifth place, is to show that God is to be solely and wholly worshipped. Chapter 12 later, chapter 13 treats of the unity of the divine essence and the distinction of three persons. Well, with regards to the latter head, those, the knowledge of man, chapter 14, treats of the creation of the world and the good and bad angels. They all have reference to man, and then in chapter 15 takes up the subject of man himself, explaining his nature and his power. The better to illustrate the nature both of God and of man in three remaining chapters, 16 through 18, proceeds to treat of the general government of the world, and particularly of the human actions in opposition to fortunate. I'm going to have to move myself out of the way here for a minute here. I'm going to just get rid of me. And it's better to illustrate the nature of both of God and man, the three remaining chapters, verses 16 through 18, proceeding to treat the general government of the world, and particularly the human actions in opposition to fortunes and fate, explain both the doctrine and the use of the inclusion of showing that through God's employs the instrumentally of the wicked, he is pure from sin and from taint in every kind. Okay, with that said, I'm just going to pause here for a minute. Okay, that brings us through the argument. Now it brings us into chapter 1. And we're going to go through each chapter, so let's just go through chapter 1. In chapter 1, we have the knowledge of God and ourselves mutually connected. Nature of the connection. Okay, sections. There are sections in this chapter. The first section, we have the sum of the wisdom, viz., the knowledge of God, of ourselves, the effects of the latter. Section 2, we're going to see the effects of the knowledge of God in humanity, our pride, our unveil, our hypocrisy, and demonstrating the absolute perfection of God and our own uttered helplessness. And then the third section, we're going to have the effects of the knowledge of God illustrated by the example 1. The holy patriarchs, 2, the holy angels, and 3, the sun and the moon. So we're going to have these three elements shown to us in the in section 3, and we're going to look at these three sections in part. Now, 1, our wisdom is so far as it's ought to be deemed truth in solemn wisdom. I lost my place. Okay, in solid wisdom, consisting almost entirely of the two parts, the knowledge of God and of ourselves. But as they are connected together by many ties, it is not easy to determine which of the two proceeds and gives birth to the other. For in the first place, no man can survive himself without forthwith turning his thoughts towards the God in whom he lives and moves, because it is perfectly obvious that the endowment which we possess cannot possibly be from ourselves, nay, that our very being is nothing else than substance in God alone. And in the second place, these blessings which increasingly distill to us from heaven are like streams of conducting us to the fountain. Here, again, the infinitude of good which resides in God, because most apparent from the poverty and the practical, the miserable ruin into which the revolt of the first man has plunged us, compels us to turn our eyes outwardly, not only that which hungers and famishing, we may thence ask what we want, but being around by fear may learn humility, for as they exist in man, something like the world is misery, and ever since we were stripped of the divine attire, our naked shame discloses the immense series of disgraceful properties, every man being stunned by the consciousness of his own unhappiness in this weary necessity, obtains at least some knowledge of God. Thus our feelings and our ignorance vainly want weakness, in short, deprives the corrupt, reminds us that Calvin on John 4:10, that in the Lord there is none but he that dwells true light of wisdom, solid virtue, experience goodness, and accordingly urgent by our own evil through the consideration the good things of God, and indeed we cannot aspire to him. In earnest unity we have begun to be displeased with ourselves. For what man is not disposes the rest of himself, who in fact does not thus rest so long as he is known to himself, that is, so long as he is content with his own endowment and unconscious of his unmindful of his misery. Every person, therefore, on coming to the knowledge of himself, is not only urged to seek God, but is also led by the hard hand of to find him. Now, too, on the other hand, it is evident that man never obtained to the true self-knowledge until he has previously contemplated the face of God and came down after such contemplation to look into himself, such as our innate pride, we always seem to ourselves just and unrightly and wise and holy until we are convicted by the clear evidence of our unjust vileness, folly, and impurity. Convicted, however, as we are, if we look to ourselves only and not to the Lord also, he begins the only standard by the application of which this conviction can be produced. For since we are all naturally prone to hypocrisy, any empty surveillance of the righteousness is quite enough to satisfy us instead of the righteousness itself. And since nothing appears within us or surrounds us, that it is the tainted with the great impurity, so long as we keep our minds within the confines of the human pollution, anything which is of the same small degree, less defiled, delights us as it were most pure, just as an eye to which nothing but black and being properly presented deems an object of a whitish or even brownish hue to be perfectly white. Nay, the bodily senses may furnish a still stronger illusion perfectly white. Nay, the bodily sense may furnish a still stronger illusion of the intent to which we are deluding in estimation the power of the mind, if at midday we either look down to the ground or on the surrounding objects which lie open to our view. We think ourselves endued with a very strong and piercing eyesight, but what we look at up to the sun and gaze at the unveiled the sight which did exceedingly well for our earth is instantly so dazzling and confounded by the refutation of the oblige to us to confess that our actionness and our discriminating material objects is merely dimmed with so long as we do not look beyond the earth. We are quite pleased with our own righteousness, wisdom, and virtue. We address ourselves in the most flattering terms, and seeing only less than the demigods, but should we once begin to raise our thoughts to God and reflect what kind of being He is, and our absolute and perfections of the righteousness and the wisdom and the virtue to which, as a standard, we are bound to be confounded. What formerly delighted us by the false showing of the righteousness which becomes polluted with the greatness inquiries which strengthened to impose upon us under the name of wisdom. We discuss by the extreme folly of what present the appearance of the virtuous energy, which be condemned as the most miserable importance, so as are these qualities in us, they seem most perfect from the correspondence to the divine purity. Hence, that dread and amazement with which the Scripture informally relates holy men were struck and overwhelmed wherever that beheld the presence of God, when we see that those who previously stood firm and secure are quaking with terror, that the fear of death takes hold of them. Nay, they are a manner of swelling up in the annihilation, and the inference to be drawn is that men are never duly touched and impressed with the conversation of their own insignificance until they are contrasted themselves with the majestics of God's frequently. Examples of the consternations and occurrence both of the books of Judges and the prophetical writings. So much so that it was the common, it was the common, both of the books of the, I skipped that already. I totally lost my place. Look in here. Well, let's just pick it up here. Nor without cause, but we see Abraham, the reader, to acknowledge himself, but the dust and ashes, and never he appropriates to beyond the glory of the Lord. And Elijah, unable to wait with unveiled faces for the approaching, so dreadfully is the sight, and the cherubim themselves must veil their faces in very terror. To this undoubted prophet Isaiah refers when he says in Isaiah 24:23, the moon shall be confounded and the sun ashamed when the Lord of hosts shall reign. Literally, when he shall exhibit the refuge and give the nearest view of the brightest object, and the comparison be covered with darkness. Just move myself for 1 second here. But though the knowledge of God and the knowledge of ourselves are brought together by the mutual ties, due arrangement requires that the treat of the former in the first place and the decrease of the latter. And that ends the reading of chapter 1, and next time we get together we'll be in chapter 2. So with that said, bye for now.